I'm proud to introduce Professor Hugh Brady, President of Imperial, to make the opening address, who will be followed by Executive Director Mike Wilkins.
Thank you, Dahlia. I just thought it'd be good to drop in to welcome you to Imperial. I've been at Imperial now for about approximately 1 year, 1 month and 30 days, but who's counting? I'm a clinician scientist, so my journey took me from Dublin, as you can probably tell from my accent, Toronto, Boston, Bristol, and all that leading up to this, certainly for me, fantastic honour to be leading Imperial. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to the conference. In many ways, this embodies what I find special about Imperial. It not only is one of the UK, Europe's, the world's greatest research universities, but it's that focus on science, engineering, medicine, and particularly of late that interface with the world of business. So innovation, application, entrepreneurship are all really part of the DNA of the institution, and hopefully that screams across in terms of the program that you will enjoy today. So we very much see our mission as not just contributing new knowledge and new technologies, but continuously exploring how we apply those, whether that be to the treatment of disease or to solving global challenges such as food security, water security, and tackling that existential threat which climate change now represents. If there's one area that our entire community is passionate about, it is that area of climate change. It permeates just about everything that we do. And in 2020, we launched our own Imperial sustainability strategy to guide us on our transition to net zero as an institution. And that deals with everything from the way we manage our own resources internally, our own policies and operations, but also how we can contribute more globally through our education, through our research, and through our collaborations, working with both industries, governments, and other organizations. And particularly how we can work with those organizations and work with that global family to achieve the transition in a fair and equitable way. We are very proud of our Centre for Climate Finance and Investment. It's part of a rich network of assets we have at Imperial that are contributing in a major way to addressing the challenge of climate change. Some of them you may know. We have the Grantham Institute, which brings together scientists and engineers from all of our faculties and particularly focuses on synthesizing policy and heightening public awareness, increasingly, of course, important given the world that we live in. We have the Energy Futures Lab, which brings together scientists and engineers to focus on the energy grid particularly, and new energy sources, and the technical resources that they will require. So some of you may have read their recent paper on rare earth materials, which is certainly worth looking at, a really important contribution. And then we have the Centre for Environmental Policy, and we're just thrilled that Professor Jim Skee of the Centre was recently appointed as chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and of course would have been contributing here if it wasn't for his duties in his new role. Dahlia summarized just some of what you're going to experience today, and Mike will do so, I'm sure, in a few minutes. But so certainly from me, the Centre highlights or underscores or is a shop window for the very best of what Imperial has to offer. So I hope that you can harness the expertise and indeed the network that the Centre offers. Important to say that it is externally funded. It was founded 7 years ago with a donation from Quinbrook Infrastructure Partners. I think on the slide, yes, we have our, some of the other partners, sponsors, friends. We are always looking for new partners. So I can't think of a better organization for your own business or your own company to sponsor than this one. And we have people who talk to you about it. But think about it. It is very important. I said we're really proud of the Centre, and that exemplifies what Imperial is about. And at its heart, you have a relatively small team, but really high quality, of interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary research and teaching faculty. So many of the challenges that we face in the world today can only be solved, can only be addressed, and indeed opportunities only harnessed by a heightened level of interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity, and indeed partnership between universities, industries and businesses, governments and other knowledge organisations. So that is very much the approach taken by the Centre, and Mike Wilkins, the Executive Director, will expand on the Centre's work in a few minutes. So I hope that you, as you look through the programme, I mean, you're here, so I hope you found the proposition compelling, and that you find the Centre and particularly the discussions and deliberations today as very relevant to your business. The Centre very much draws on that intersection between the traditional strength of Imperial, of science, engineering and medicine, with the relatively young new kid on the block, the business school. And undoubtedly what makes Imperial Business School unique on the global stage is that intersection between the world of business and the scholarship of business and its disciplines with the STEM disciplines. Very few, most institutions talk the talk, very few walk the walk the way that our business school does. So today you'll hear about the latest innovations in financing, in research and analytics. I'd like to thank all the speakers who have joined us, and actually part of the stress of organising a really high quality conference on such contemporary issues is you do have speakers occasionally, whether that be COVID or other things, dropping in and dropping out. And I just say that the team look incredibly relaxed this morning. And that belies probably a heart rate that is twice what they normally have. So a really huge thank you to everybody at the Centre, because it has been all shoulders to the wheel over the last few days, and particularly over the last 24 hours, and for organising a fantastic event. Thank you to you, Dalia, for your contribution. Thank you all for joining us. I look forward to, can't stay with you for the whole day, but certainly look forward to hearing of the outcomes of your deliberations. So welcome again. Thanks for joining us, and over to you, Mike.
Thank you. Good. Well, thank you very much, Hugh, for those opening remarks. And I'm really pleased to be opening today's inaugural CCFI conference, New Frontiers in Climate Finance. My name is Mike Wilkins. I am the Executive Director of the Centre for Climate Finance and Investment, also Professor of Practice here at Imperial College Business School. Prior to joining the Business School in 2021, I spent 28 years at S&P Global Ratings. So it's particularly, I suppose, pleasing to me to see S&P Global Ratings sponsor this event today. It's great to get some money out of them eventually. So with that, just a few remarks about what's coming up. You will have seen the agendas coming up on the screen, but I'm just going to give you a quick canter through the sessions which are going to be taking place throughout the day. And it's going to be an absolutely stimulating day, I can assure you. And where we hope to showcase the latest thinking and research from Imperial College, not just from the Centre for Climate Finance and Investment, but also from the many other parts of the college which together make Imperial a leading global academic centre of excellence in the fight to tackle climate change through scientific and financial innovation. And the big question arising from the UN General Assembly last week and the numerous side events that took place in New York is what progress, if any, can now be expected from COP28, the UN Climate Change Summit happening in Dubai, on the topic of climate finance. On the positive side of the equation, there is a growing momentum towards expanding lending in new climate finance initiatives, as was put forward by the World Bank. And private sector investment in green tech is also exploding. You'll be hearing more about this shortly during the opening panel by the CCFI's Clean Energy lead, Millie Fomikoff, who together with the International Energy Agency has released a series of groundbreaking reports on how to unlock more private capital for renewables globally. particularly in developing countries. And although Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was not in New York last week, probably just as well given the reaction to his recent announcement on scaling back the UK's net zero policies, James Cleverly, the UK Foreign Secretary, was. He announced plans to unlock up to $1.8 billion in climate finance that is sitting in international financial institutions using loan guarantees. Blended finance, which essentially is what this is a term we've been hearing a lot about in climate finance circles over the 8 years since the Paris Agreement was signed, but we have very little to show for it so far. We will be exploring this topic of blended finance to support the 8 times capital growth that is required to meet reduced emission reduction targets. And closer to home, private finance is also needed to scale adaptation investment in the UK and also here in London. But barriers remain to enable this, including lack of return, small size, impact measurement and knowledge. In 2022, only 1% of green bonds proceeds in the UK went to adaptation. We'll be hearing a lot more about this in the first keynote guest, Emma Howard-Boyd, who is chair of the UK Green Finance Institute and also, importantly, the London Climate Resilience Review, which we at the CCFI will be happy, or are happy, to actually participate in. New and innovative financial instruments exist to finance and fund adaptation, such as resilience and adaptation bonds, as outlined in the recent research paper by the CCFI. But beyond financing solutions, we need a new approach to adaptation and resilience, including nature-based solutions and leveraging technological innovation. Inspiration for a climate technology revolution is often drawn from single projects, but averting dangerous climate change cannot be solved by a single new technology, deployed by a single government. The technology changes needed to address climate change fundamentally will have to be pervasive. They will have to involve markets, and they will have to be global in scope. These issues will be explored in more detail in the Climate FinTech panel led by CCFI's Yilka Hassaj before the lunch break. And among other things, this panel will stress the urgent need for investments in climate FinTech from both public and private investors. And while there is a significant opportunity for pre-seed and seed round investments, the same level of support often seems lacking for climate innovations during the growth phase. This prompts us to consider what lessons we can draw from the fintech community's success in attracting investments and achieving financial disruption on a global scale. After what will be a well-earned lunch break, in our second keynote session, we should be exploring the challenges around the energy transition, especially considering the current trends in the UK and elsewhere to roll back net zero transition policies. For this, I'll be in conversation with Joe Paisley, President of the GARP Risk Institute. And for those of you who don't know what GARP stands for, it's the Global Association of Risk Professionals. Joe's got a 20-year career spanning the Bank of England, the FCA, the PRA, and also HSBC, and will be giving her unique insight on risk management, climate stress testing, and prudential regulation. I won't steal Joe's thunder, but I expect a frank and honest exchange of views, given the current situation here in the UK, and there will be a few punches pulled, I imagine. The next challenge will be how to incorporate nature into stress tests and scenarios. And as evidenced by the launch of the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures recommendations last week, there now seems to be as much focus on nature as there is on climate in financial and investment circles. And this is hardly surprising, since all businesses depend on natural capital, with over half of the world's GDP having been assessed as moderately or highly exposed to nature. This dependency also extends to financial institutions, as a recent report by the European Central Bank shows that nearly 75% of all bank loans in the euro area are extended to companies that are highly dependent on nature. And in a panel led by the CCFI's Nature Research Lead, Pernille Holtedal, we shall explore how nature is not a sector, but the underpinning of our well-being. The panel will be asking, what does investing in nature and biodiversity mean, and where does it go from here? Agriculture is the primary driver of nature loss, but what are the new business models which will allow us to produce food for an expanding global population while also safeguarding the natural environment? What is the progress on the integration of nature-related risk in corporate and financial institutions? And can we learn from our experience in integrating climate risk? And what will this integration lead us to? Last week's Climate Week in New York also saw increased scrutiny of financial institutions' climate risk management by regulators and financial supervisors. In a panel led by Associate Professor Enrique Biffis, here from the Imperial College Business School, we shall be discussing our recent research developments into climate risk analytics, climate-sensitive valuation, stress testing, and also scenario design. And that will be in association with the work we've been doing with the Singapore Green Finance Centre, which we co-manage with the Singapore Management University, and also the work that we've been undertaking for Standard Chartered Bank. We shall also hear about the latest science on tropical cyclone risk led by the Grantham Institute at Imperial's director, Professor Ralph Toomey, a renowned expert in this field. Our last panel of the day will focus on the role of digitalization in climate finance, focusing on data management, integrity, and the use of technologies in tackling climate change. It will focus on the importance of high-quality climate data, physical risk and resilience, open source sharing trends, and case studies such as the voluntary carbon markets and data solutions. We look forward to a future of climate finance which is deeply rooted in the provision of timely data and analytics. Panelists will explore the latest technology developments and progress on climate information architecture, geospatial finance measurement and observations. These are truly the new frontiers of climate finance. And finally, just to say that today would have not been possible without the kind support of our partners and sponsors, Quinbrook Infrastructure Partners, S&P Global Ratings, Standard Chartered, and the Singapore Green Finance Centre. We are also grateful to our media partner, Responsible Investor. We hope that you find today insightful and thought-provoking. Please don't hesitate to contact us at CCFI should you have any questions or wish to explore any of these themes further. And we remain open, as Hugh said, to funding, collaborations and partnership. And we hope today will inspire you to help us address the biggest challenges in mobilizing climate finance and investment to secure a better future for all. Now, let's get the show started with our first panel on new finance mechanisms for renewables and clean technology, moderated by my colleague Millie Fomikoff, and who is the lead for clean energy research at the CCFI. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. And following our great introductions, we're really delighted to be joined by our esteemed panel, Inchan Hwang from British International Investments. We have Keith Gaines from Quinbrook and John Murton from Standard Chartered. As Mike mentioned, we will be focusing on clean energy investments and how we really unlock capital for global renewables in developed and developing economies. So we're going to start with a brief presentation that summarizes our 4 joint papers with the International Energy Agency. And Inchan was actually at the International Energy Agency when we wrote all of these reports and was our co-author. So we're really also delighted that he can also speak about that as well. So we will focus on primarily emerging market renewables, and we will show you some data and evidence that can demonstrate that this investment absolutely makes a lot of sense from a financial perspective as well. So we can start by summarizing a few reports that we just outlined. So the National Energy Agency and Imperial College London, our center at Imperial, with our IEA colleagues, wrote 4 reports that really have this main aim to provide more data and transparency that will help financial institutions and policymakers play a bigger role in the energy transition. So we focus on the key building blocks of risk and return across the power sector globally in developed and developing economies. And we ask one main question: does this investment make sense from a purely financial perspective, in terms of if you're just seeking returns and to really enhance your portfolio returns? And the answer is yes. So we show global listed and unlisted renewables relative to various asset classes that are global equities, bonds, global infrastructure investments. And we actually demonstrate that both unlisted and unlisted renewables have posted higher returns over the last decade than a lot of other investable asset classes. And one particular segment of this market that is unlisted also has been able to produce this kind of return with relatively low volatility. So on a risk-adjusted basis, renewables investments globally make a lot of sense if you're thinking about including them in your portfolio if you're an investor. So not only that they were able to show and demonstrate great returns, also when you're thinking about their diversification benefits, renewables don't really correlate with almost any other investable asset class, which is a portfolio manager's dream. And I know some of you here are in investment management and would always want to have an asset that is diversifying. Well, if you look at here, global listed and unlisted renewables relative to global bonds, to global equities, to different commodities, they really don't show any significant correlation with any of them. Maybe a little bit more with corporate bonds, but that's really interesting because we're looking at equity market returns of our renewables portfolios, and if there is any asset class that they actually do show some correlation is really global corporate bond index. So this clearly demonstrates that it is a very different kind of asset that is not responding to different commodity price cycles in the same way. So not only that we looked at them over the last 10 years, how they perform more broadly, but we also isolated different macroeconomic regimes such as credit conditions, interest rate environments, global commodity cycles. And they have shown very different reaction to different macroeconomic cycles, which is really interesting if you're kind of thinking managing your assets across different economic regimes. And this is not just for investors. This is also potentially for oil majors and different companies who are thinking about this diversifying stream of returns that is really more immune to credit shocks, to interest rate environments in terms of higher interest rates, and also they're not as responsive to different commodity prices. So this further demonstrates their diversification benefit in addition to their really strong risk-adjusted returns over the last decade. But we don't want to say this is going to continue in perpetuity, but they have been able to demonstrate this previously, and then we will then unpack some mechanisms that could potentially continue supporting this asset class to continue delivering strong returns. So we have shown this for our global renewable assets across listed and unlisted markets. And now we turn to emerging markets. And even in emerging markets, our portfolio that is quite concentrated because we don't really have a lot of assets to observe in this market, unfortunately. Even in emerging markets, renewables have demonstrated pretty significant performance, but we do want to caveat this with something. It really requires multiple economic agents to come together for certain assets, renewables assets in emerging markets, to provide this really strong return stream. unlike, your investment in, a typical, let's say, solar investment in Portugal, in Africa, for example, you sometimes need a global bank, a developed market government, and a local utility to come together to provide that kind of return stream. So, to be very clear, you can harvest certain returns in emerging markets, but it has to be done in a very coordinated way, and it requires, multiple, sometimes, agents to come together to really deliver that. And in our third report, that is climate infrastructure, we do actually demonstrate how, for example, Norfund and their investments in Africa, Standard Chartered's in financing in Pakistan and different jurisdictions actually yielded some similar returns and yields as some of their developed investments, but actually required a lot more coordination. So it's not easy to deliver this, but it is possible. And then we turn our attention to the ASEAN region. That is actually quite interesting, and this fastly growing region that really needs a lot more energy and a lot more renewables. And we looked at also their renewables returns, and it seems like they're not, this, crazy astronomical returns that you're going to be chasing as potentially a hedge fund manager, but as an infrastructure investor or as a long-term asset manager, it's still, it's quite interesting. But again, we have to caveat this that again, it is very concentrated, and it is primarily based in the Philippines in terms of a lot of these assets that we are observing. And that's a big issue with emerging markets. Sometimes your portfolio is heavily concentrated because there is not a lot of data and transparency. So you have to layer your portfolios with a lot of individual case studies and that you're observing that don't make their way into any kind of public data set. So with a lot of our reports, I would really encourage you to look at them and how we approach this kind of global universe defined by global listed assets that are trading on different exchanges, ADEC infrastructure indices, and different case studies where we're able to unpack a lot more information and data that simply would never make its way into anything that is kind of this public data set. So we have been able to layer this with a lot of really interesting examples that could give you kind of even more excitement and confidence to go into this market. So now that we know that it is possible to harvest certain returns in emerging markets, including the ASEAN region, are we seeing enough investments? The answer is absolutely not even close. So what, for example, one region, the ASEAN region, requires on a yearly basis is roughly $180 billion until 2030. And what's actually invested in this region is roughly $30 billion. So you have this massive shortfall of roughly $150 billion annually, which is quite substantial. And that kind of gap you don't really see in any developed economy. So I would encourage everyone that is, considering investments in renewables that is or already has some kind of exposure to think about this global diversification and this untapped or quasi-untapped part of the market that actually requires so much more investment. But then, as we mentioned earlier, it would need to be managed in a very different way. So how do we actually get more assets into this market? Not just the ASEAN region, but towards developing economies more broadly. Well, we need so many different mechanisms to really further develop. And we will outline a few of them, and actually our panel will be discussing also some of our solutions and what they're observing. First, we need more data, and we need not just more data, but better data. And I would encourage, anyone here who is investing in emerging market renewables to contribute to our Cost of Capital Observatory initiative that we are running with our National Energy Agency, the World Economic Forum, and ETH Zurich, when we're trying to get investors to contribute this information on a yearly basis. So not only dedicated players who are specialized investors go into this market, but to give a lot more data and understanding to certain investors who have this massive pool of capital, but simply do not have enough understanding of this market. If we did have this observatory that shows your cost of capital and different performance metrics, it would actually help for investors to be a little bit more open to channeling their capital towards this region. So if you do have the data, we would encourage you to reach out and to contribute to our Cost of Capital Observatory. That is one initiative that will be this big repository of data for emerging market renewables for the cost of capital, decomposing what drives it. Then we, of course, need stronger regulatory framework, and we need more certainty in certain jurisdictions, and that really sits within, with their local governments. More robust financial market frameworks. We're seeing some development, but not enough. And one thing to note, we need more transition frameworks. So you don't have this bifurcated market where you're just piling into, what's already green, but also for transitioning activities. And that's not truly developed in most jurisdictions. We will, discuss briefly enhanced role for development finance institutions who could potentially de-risk some of these projects to a certain extent. And of course, greater access to risk hedging tools, because a lot of investors would not really consider investing in a certain jurisdiction if they can harvest, a certain return stream or a certain IRR in Portugal, versus, let's say in Thailand, we know that country risk premia and their, FX volatility will simply lead them towards Portugal. So we need to have more tools. And actually, there are some pilot programs that we're going to highlight that I think would be quite interesting, where you can risk share your exposures to certain sovereign and currency risks if you invest in renewables. And that is run by the World Bank, World Economic Forum, and Columbia University. And then finally, we need a better grid. We need a much better grid in a lot of markets. And without solid grid investments, you can have all this capacity, but you can't really use it and channel it appropriately. So we will discuss some of them with our panel, and we need, as we mentioned, different market players to come together. And we do have different market players here, a development investor, a traditional infrastructure investor, a global lender, and an issuer. So we will be discussing how we can all collectively drive this forward and how we can get more capital into emerging markets. So before we start our discussion, it would be fantastic to hear from all of you a little bit more about your role and your institution's role in renewables investments. Inchan, you want to start?
Yes, sure. So thank you, Millie. First of all, I'm very thrilled and honored to be here today with distinguished panel member. So thank you very much, Millie and Mike and the Imperial team. So my name is Inchan Hwang, and I'm an investment executive at British International Investment. BII is a UK development finance institution, and formerly we were known as CDC Group. We invest in emerging markets, including Africa, Southeast Asia, South Asia, covering infrastructure, financial services, manufacturing, telecom, and technology sectors. So BII has a dual mandate. We look at development impact, and also we look for successful businesses and good investment opportunities. Because if investment is not successful, then there will be no sustained impact. We will touch upon BII's initiatives in blended finance structure and renewable projects in ASEAN markets specifically. But I really want to highlight that the real motive behind joining BII was during our research between IA and Imperial, we struggled a lot to find reliable data on emerging market. But we had a conviction that emerging market will deliver good return, good risk-adjusted return, and I am trying to prove that also at the DFI at British International Investment.
That's phenomenal to hear that now, some of the stuff that we have actually looked at, you can invest in and drive some capital in that direction. Thank you. John, what do you?
Hi everyone, my name is John Murton. I'm Standard Chartered Bank's Senior Sustainability Advisor. Standard Chartered Bank is a bank that not many people in the UK have heard of unless they're interested in Liverpool Football Club, who we sponsor the shirts of. But it's one of the 5 biggest banks in the UK, and it's one of the 50 biggest banks in the world. But you won't have heard of it often in the UK because we don't have a retail presence here. But we're actually centered, our markets are centered around Asia, the Middle East and Africa. So 85% of our revenue comes from Asia, Middle East and Africa. And we've got a footprint in 53 markets across those continents. We serve clients in 120 countries. And according to Convergence, historically, we have been the leading bank in terms of providing blended finance to global markets. So my role in Standard Chartered is I lead our innovation hub in terms of blended finance, looking at how we can apply blended finance and develop blended finance products that we can deploy in pursuit of our sustainability goals. Because as has been mentioned, we are on track to a low carbon economy around the world. The technology is clear. Whether we get there fast enough to meet our climate goals is another question. And blended finance is one of the ways that we can accelerate that trajectory. My background isn't in banking. I've spent 25 years in the UK government, most recently leading our diplomacy for COP26. So in that sense, I'm well capable of bringing the public sector and the private sector together, because that's what I've done most of my career.
Thank you, John. Keith?
Hi, everybody. Keith Gaines. I'm a Senior Director at Quinbrook, based in London. Just a quick bit on the centre. We've supported the centre since 2017, as Mike and Hugh have noted. We've also been very much a beneficiary of the centre. 3 of our 11-strong asset management team and investment management team in London are former Imperial pupils, and for that we're very thankful. They are very high-quality people. So thanks for your good work. I hope it continues. What do we do at Quinbrook? We invest in renewable infrastructure, grid support infrastructure, and also the energy transition. Along with the founders, I've been doing so for over 20 years. We used to just call it renewables, but that's moved on to net zero, the energy transition, and there's many, many other straplines that we can use. We principally invest across the UK, the US, and Australia. So we're not in emerging markets at the moment, but hopefully we can give some insights into what leads us to those markets rather than the emerging markets. We've invested across many, many technologies, landfill gas, hydro, wind, solar, synchronous condensers, which are a new technology or an old technology which are being repurposed for the UK market, and we see going overseas as well. And we're now looking to invest in green data centres in the US predominantly. So a wide range of investments. And most of what we invest in, or most of the money we invest, comes from pension funds, both in the UK and overseas.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, we need to get you also to a guest lecture about your green data centers, given that is one of my lectures. So that would be fantastic to hear from you. And as you heard from our panelists, they have various roles in terms of supporting this market and financing this market, either through their lending activities or their direct investment activities. So speaking about your lending and direct investment activities, when you're looking at different investments globally, and so let's start with you, Inchan, and given your organizational focus on developing economies, you clearly see a lot of opportunity there for many different reasons. But can you also highlight some really significant challenges that you are seeing when it comes to renewables? Because I know BII invests in healthcare, education, and now also renewables. When it comes to renewables particularly, can you highlight some challenges and potentially how BII is addressing them?
Sure. So I'm still absorbing my organization's 75-year-long data when it comes to emerging market investing. But I think there are many challenges and many opportunities. But if I summarize it into top 3 challenges, that will be: one is currently the global macro environment is very challenging. If you're looking at the risk-free rate, the US 10-year Treasury will yield around 4.8%, US junk bond will yield over 8%. So if you're not an emerging market investor, you really need a good justification why this is a good and attractive time to look at these assets. So there is a shortage of capital and lack of interest in the market. So that's the one challenge we have, especially when it comes to frontier markets in Africa. The second challenge is also the FX. If you're looking at India, for instance, the currency has depreciated around 3% ever since the global financial crisis. If you look at South Africa, they have been depreciating around 6%. I think Southeast Asia has been doing relatively well, especially during COVID and recent years. I think some of them is partially supported by their strong economic growth in high single digit. But this is one of the big criteria you need to consider when you're looking at general infrastructure investing in these markets, but especially for renewables. Lastly, the big challenge, especially if you're a more traditional infra investors within this space, is you will find not that many bankable operating assets in Southeast Asia or across any other emerging markets. And that's been a particular challenge in Southeast Asia because a lot of these pension funds or big infra players, they will look at an asset or a platform at a certain scale, and also ideally they need to be in operation or near construction. But a lot of capitals that we don't see in this market is really funding the developer, the early stage investing, so that some of this early stage capital can be unlocked and be scaled to become in operation and to be bankable and to be sellable to these pension funds and traditional investors. So we don't see that happening yet. We see a couple of players in this early stage, both in growth equity and infra space, especially in Southeast Asia, but this will be a critical moment. And maybe to add one more point is, as you mentioned, the grid connectivity is a significant issue. A lot of countries in Southeast Asia, they have renewable energy plan net zero targets, and they've pledged to various climate goals. But the challenge is their grid really needs to be upgraded to absorb utility scale renewable energy capacity and also manage the intermittency issue of solar and wind power projects. And not all of their grids are interconnected in their country. So they really need to think about grid by grid. For instance, for Indonesia, Philippines, it will be specific to certain islands. So these are the key challenges that we've identified. And I think as a development finance institution, our focus is how we could support these developers and unlock the roadblocks in this market to create more opportunities for traditional infra investors in this space.
Thank you, Inchan. And you highlighted, so many critical points, and a few to highlight. What's really interesting, you said if you're not an emerging market investor, and I think that is so important because you're seeing so many big engines of capital. Global CIO teams for big banks have been shrinking their emerging market exposure because some of the issues that Inchan highlighted that are related to FX. Your volatility simply, of that part of the portfolio is going to be so much higher. And that is one of the things that we want to highlight here is how we can potentially think about different mechanisms that are going to bring this asset class with other players or through some risk management structures, blended finance structures that are getting closer to other comparables. And also your point about FX grid is something that we're going to unpack a little bit more, because without that, really, it's just going to be really, really challenging. And also when it comes to different lending activities, Standard Chartered, as all is as John mentioned, one of the biggest emerging market issuers. So they don't need convincing clearly to go into this market. But even as a dedicated player for so many years, what are some of the challenges, John, that you are seeing, and specifically how is Standard Chartered addressing some of their risk and risk management when it comes to allocating and funding emerging market renewables specifically?
Thanks very much. Any good Church of England curate knows that to make your point, you have to have 3 points, and they have to begin with the same letter. And then the congregation go home and they remember the things that you said. So the sort of things I'd point to are policy, pricing, and pipeline. And as you say, country risk is a concern for many lenders. We are present in many countries where other lenders are not. And so, you aim off for what I say in that regard. But taking them in turn, policy is a big barrier to investment in renewables. In my previous role, I used to go around the world and talk about renewable energy, and many ministers would say to me, yes, please bring investors in renewable energy into my country. And I'd have to say, yes, well, first of all, please change your law so that private sector companies can invest in your energy sector, because that's simply not possible in your country at the moment. So, simple policy measures are sometimes a barrier to foreign investment or private sector investment in the energy sector. There are other sort of more subtle barriers that are in place. So many countries, for example, prevent the securitization of assets and the recycling of assets. And for a bank that keeps its loans for a certain period, we often like to lend to a project, and once it's up and running and the revenues are flowing, we will securitize it, sell the lending on. If you can't do that, that limits your capacity to lend against future assets. And there are many sort of policy perversities in some countries that actually sort of disadvantage the renewable sector versus the fossil fuel sector. So you'll see countries where you've got domestic market obligations for coal, for example, which actually lower the cost of coal for coal-fired power stations at the expense of renewable generation. Or you'll see countries where the pricing structure for electricity is set so that it gives preference to dispatchability as opposed to availability of power, and that can be a barrier for renewables. And there are mechanisms you can employ to overcome those sorts of things, like contracts for difference and so on, but they're not present in every country, and so we need to tackle some of those policy barriers, because actually that bleeds in then to pricing. Pricing becomes a problem, whether it's due to sort of the absence of a counterparty guarantee, the absence of a predictable stream of income through something like a contracts for difference, or exchange rate risk, as has been mentioned. All these things affect the pricing, and if you don't have sort of, for example, your offtake written into foreign currency, then exchange rate risk becomes a real problem, and that affects pricing and the capacity of us to lend. And then the last point is pipeline. That in many countries there is a shortage of projects to bank. Now, I know that's a subject to debate, and when you speak to project developers, they'll say there are plenty of projects, there's a shortage of lending, and you can take your view on that. But our experience is in many countries that the bankable projects that are there are few, and that sees a lot of competing between private sector lenders and also some of the MDBs who are keen to demonstrate that they've lent to certain volumes of renewable projects, and we can speak about that a little bit later, about how to deconflict private lending and public sector lending.
Thank you, John. And a few things that you mentioned in terms of not enough policy certainty, and we have been seeing that a lot of investors are sitting on the sidelines because of that, because things can be quite murky and opaque. And this is one of the things that we have been trying to demonstrate, or actually highlight certain domestic policies and potentially focus on a few recommendations that are not just for global investors, but to John's point, if their local governments are not giving investors enough certainty or mechanisms, it is really, really challenging. And also another thing that you mentioned was related to some existing interests in coal, and we have also noticed this in the ASEAN region when we look at the cost of capital for solar, wind, versus some of their coal assets. That differential is just so significant. And that is not just focusing on what global investors or different development or institutions can do, but also what can be done at that country level, because the existing interest in coal sometimes really drives the cost of capital down for their coal assets and exponential increases for their renewable assets.
Just at one point, to pick up on what you're saying, is one of the things that also we struggle with in some countries is, and this is why universities are so important, is a lot of engineers who make policy in many countries had their education in kind of the 80s and 90s, when it was assumed that you could only have like 5% power from renewables on a grid without it falling over, and they write that into the sort of policy frameworks and the preferences that go with that. And then there are demand models, so if you're a growing economy, maybe in Southeast Asia, you predict future demand, and actually demand predictions can be sort of bullish, I think is probably a good word to use, and they over-assume demand and don't allow for sort of increased energy efficiency, and so they build out firm power to meet a core of that demand and leave a surplus for renewables that they will contract later. And then, of course, power demand doesn't grow as fast as predicted, so then they've already got built out this amount of fossil fuel power, so then the requirement for variable renewables to top that up is very diminished. So kind of that kind of policy setting framework and the role of making sure that there are recent graduates or people who've been exposed to markets where we've achieved much higher penetrations of renewables is really important.
Absolutely. So I know we may have some students in the room, so we hope that a lot of, so if you decide to focus on this, you can also influence some local government decisions, and if you go back to certain regions where you can really move the dial and help significantly. And actually, our latest report will be about a specific country, Vietnam, and we'll be addressing some local and global initiatives that really have to take place for really to move this forward. Thank you, John and Keith. I know you're primarily investing in developed markets, based on our call earlier last week. So I would love to hear from you in terms of what would need to happen for you to have a chunky allocation to emerging market renewables, not just like challenges, but what would some unlocking mechanisms, what would you like to see for this to happen?
I think critical to us, and this is in the markets we work in at the moment as well, it's all about confidence. Confidence that the money we invest, we're going to get back. The UK's had 3 decades of support mechanisms. You go back to the 90s, we had, for those who are old enough to remember, non-fossil fuel obligations. We've got the renewables obligation, we've got contract for difference that John mentioned. We've got feed-in tariffs, Pathfinder. All of these are governmental-backed revenue streams that give us confidence that we're actually going to get our money back that we invest. Debatable, but we've also got a strong government in the UK. And that's something which is pretty key. Again, we've got confidence that the regulations that have been in place are going to stay in place for a long time. Italy and Spain are not emerging markets. They cut the subsidies they gave to solar farms a number of years back. That undermined confidence in investment in those 2 countries. And they're not emerging markets by any way, shape or form. They're very much developed countries. So for us to go into countries that are considered emerging, we would need to know that the political situation was fairly stable. One of the things I read over the last few days, in less than 3 years, there's been 13 attempted coups throughout Africa. That would give us a huge lack of confidence in those countries. We need strong grid. The UK has a massive issue with the grid at the moment, and we're very much a developed country. And these countries are building the grid, and our grid is old. Our grid needs retrospective change to be able to put all of the renewables that we need. Emerging countries are developing their grid, and if they develop it in the right way, they won't encounter the issues we're having now. So development risk, we need to know that the money we invest at the development stage is not going to be wasted. We need some certainty that these projects are going to come to fruition. Currency risk, as the guy said earlier, I think the pound's devalued about 4% against the dollar over the last few weeks. So that's an issue for us here. Currencies throughout the Southeast Asian Association, I was talking to John earlier, Standard Chartered are one of the few banks who swap, ringgits to certain other currencies. So, being able to get certainty of who we can swap our currencies with and get long-term hedges and interest rates, they've gone up massively over the last 18 months. All of these are risks here in in developed markets, and we would need those to be offset in emerging markets as well.
Thank you, and you mentioned some general emerging market risks that are really challenging for certain investors. We looked at actually for all Southeast Asian currencies and their volatility versus the US dollar and different currencies, and it is quite substantial, and it is beyond certain parameters that some investors are willing to bear. So let's focus on a few things, given that a few things that were mentioned that are really 2 critical barriers are currency and the grid. So can we potentially have a brief discussion before we open it for Q&A about both? In terms of grid investments, who should be funding this, given that you're seeing certain return on investment that is really not comparable with some other assets, and it's not as high. So of course, a lot of corporate investors do not go and are not grid investors. So who should then be really responsible for enabling this mechanism for private investors to come in and actually build more renewable capacity? Inchan, do you want to share your thoughts on that?
Yes, sure. I can share my view. It's a tough question, and I think it really depends how you view grid as an infrastructure. And to me personally, I think grid infrastructure is very pivotal and central to the national security. So I think it would make sense that the government or sovereign entity still be an anchor investor and own the majority shares of the grid infrastructure system. But as they need to expand and upgrade, and also operation and maintenance is a big issue for a lot of emerging markets. They will need more upfront capital. They will need potentially multilateral development banks and DFIs should be able to support some of their financing by providing concessional or patient equity tranche to these grid infrastructures. But also, as we go forward, I think local lenders and also maybe international investors should be mobilized into these investors once development banks and sovereign entities provide some sort of risk protection by providing junior equity or by lowering the debt service coverage ratio, or even providing a concessional loan to provide or enhance returns for the senior lenders. I think a lot of this blended structure has been discussed and now currently being tested in a couple of markets. Yep. But we need really, this needs to be scaled in this current macro environment.
Thank you, Inchan. Any thoughts from?
One comment I would just add is, and I agree with everything that was said, is if you look at the energy system in a holistic fashion, you can sometimes question the need for grid. So if you take South Africa, for an example, within the context of the Just Energy Transition Partnership, project developers of solar farms want to build their solar farms in the Western Cape because it's the sunniest part of South Africa and the insulation is highest. But that leaves a big grid connection that has to be built by someone. And at a system cost level, it's much cheaper to build the solar farms in Mpumalanga, where the coal mines are set to close down, as South Africa decarbonizes, and insulation is maybe 10, 15% lower. So you get a slightly reduced return on the PV infrastructure, but you don't need to build the transmission infrastructure because it's already there. So sometimes you have to look at these things at a system perspective and make sure that you've got that overview in order to determine whether in fact you need that grid or not. Mm-hmm. And then of course, the other thing is if you look at it from a system perspective, you see this in the UK as well, you know, if you've got, or in Vietnam, for example, if you've got a lot of offshore wind you're going to build the ring main so that everyone can connect into it, and you have, you know, 1 or 2 onshore connectors rather than having an onshore connector for every farm that you build out. So kind of grid financing has to be sort of wrapped into a more holistic interpretation, a holistic understanding of what you want your electricity grid to do and what you require from it.
Thank you. You brought up a really important point in terms of it has to be done really holistically, and this is what we'll be unpacking in our upcoming report related to Vietnam renewables, and we will be featuring some potential investments in offshore wind and some, you know, grid investments in tandem with that. To your point, it has to be done in a very integrated way. And Keith, any thoughts from you about grid?
We've wanted to invest in grid for a number of years. In the UK, National Grid or Scottish Power Transmission up in Scotland are the principal owners of the grid. Mm-hmm. And you know, as Inchan said, it should be down to governments to control the grid. It is critical infrastructure. We would love to sit alongside these companies to enable them to build out the grid faster. If it's an issue for us, it's an issue for most of the world. If we were to go and ask for a relatively large grid connection today, we're going to probably be told, I will connect you in 2038. That's not really going to help us get to net zero. So the level of investment that's required for grid is pretty significant. And why shouldn't it come from UK local authority pension funds, which is where a lot of our investment comes from? Those types of funders should own those assets. It's UK investment in UK assets. And why shouldn't we take that overseas as well?
Fair. Yeah, 2038, that's not very speedy. Agreed. And in terms of, so we can, you know, turn to Q&A, but before we do, just a quick point on the other issue that we highlighted was, you know, another risk from currency risk. We would love to flag this FX hedging facility that I mentioned. The World Bank, World Economic Forum, and Columbia University have piloted, and is very specific to emerging markets. It is emerging market renewables. It is a general EM risk, but in this particular instance, they made it quite specific with their pilot to say, you know, if you invest in renewables in a certain country, and if their FX risk profile is preventing you from doing so, then it will potentially we can think about structuring something that you can share that risk. And just to highlight, there is no such thing as risk mitigation when it comes to currency. There is only risk distribution, because as some of you have mentioned, you cannot really get this contract that is for the entire duration of your project that is hedged back to your local currency. So you will be exposed to a certain extent, and actually quite a significant extent. So this pilot is saying the first tranche will, any kind of shortfall or devaluation in their local currency versus your own FX will be covered by credits from the renewable project secured at, let's say, $14 a ton by one of the MDBs, either the Asian Development Bank or the World Bank. And the second tranche will be either their local government or another MDB, and then private investors would be the third tranche, where they do have to bear at least 1/3 of that risk. So you would do kind of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. That is a lot more palatable for investors versus this entire devaluation that can sometimes wipe out your entire return stream. So if a few agents are sharing that, and if one of the MDBs, in this particular instance, the World Bank that is piloting this, versus their investment of, let's say, $100 to $800 million, they can use this as a multiplier effect, saying, I'm going to secure for a bunch of investors, let's say, CPPIB, Norges, and a few others who are huge infrastructure investors that are not big EM infrastructure investors, saying, if you want to go into this market, potentially we can secure or take 1/3 of your FX risk, with some private investors, philanthropic institutions, taking another third, and of course, you being, left to bear some of that, and potentially through some carbon credits that can be further muting that. So it is this risk distribution concept, which it is quite interesting, not seamless, but interesting. And with that, it would be great to hear from you, and also for you to use this opportunity to ask questions, please.
Yes. So thank you for insightful sharing. I'm a student at Imperial. And I'm just wondering, just now you mentioned a lot of risks related to market, policy, but not really covering the social risk. And so especially in a lot of projects are actually happening in developing countries where they're very industrialized and demanding for higher and higher energy. And the shift to renewable maybe change their, for example, increase more energy costs to them. So I'm just wondering, how do you manage or value the social risk in these developing countries to ensure just transition?
Who would like to take this?
I can take first. So I think there are two different aspects. So one is maybe more related to environment and social safeguard, ENS risks in the project sites. And the second part would be, as you said, rising cost of electricity. And I think that's been one of the biggest challenge in some emerging markets like Indonesia, because their electricity price has been already heavily subsidized, and it's mostly from the coal. I think their residential electricity price is 0.02 cents per kilowatt. So it's significantly lower than other markets. So if you're a renewable energy power producer, it's really difficult to sell it at that price, so you will not invest in any project. So the government still heavily subsidizes the renewable energy pricing. I think the trend that we are observing is this gap is still big between the cost of coal-based power generation and then renewable energy. It's still big, but they are narrowing down. And then the government has announced a couple of plans to cut the subsidies on fossil fuel based on power generation. And I think the way to finance this gap and in a way to mitigate the rising electricity price is really deploying at scale for renewable, utility scale renewables in the region. But also that relates to the grid connectivities and regulatory issues and PPA auctions, et cetera. So I don't think I answered your questions in a way that you would like to hear, but these are some of the observations that we are having in Southeast Asia market specifically.
Thank you, and John?
Thanks. So I might take a slightly different tack than Inchan. If you zoom the camera back, subsidies aside, the cost of renewables is cheaper than the cost of fossil fuels. The cost of renewables is falling very swiftly and will be much cheaper than the cost of fossil fuels. And in many countries already, if you speak to interlocutors, they will acknowledge, for example, that the cost of distribution of electricity from centralized generation facilities is greater than the cost of renewables. So even if you could produce power for free from a coal-fired power station, it would cost more to send it down the wire to the consumer than it would cost for the consumer to build and operate a solar power station at their site. So that is going to be massively destructive. And a comparator I would draw to your attention is, until the end of the 19th century, the transportation and distribution of ice was one of the five largest industries in North America. Cutting ice from Canadian lakes, taking it down on insulated wagons to New Orleans to serve in a cocktail, that distribution of ice and for medical storage and so on was one of the 5 largest industries in North America. It died in a matter of years with the invention of the capacity to freeze your own water and create your own ice. And if you can produce power yourself, cheaper than it costs a central electricity generating sort of facility to send it down a wire to you, that is hugely destructive. And that transformation is going to happen, and it's going to happen at pace. And the barrier to that transformation happening in many countries is therefore not economic, it's political. This was the basis of the South African Just Energy Transition Partnership. The South African government knew that it was economic to move to renewable energy, but the political cost was too significant. And it was the political cost that we needed to solve for in designing the Just Energy Transition Partnership, so that it was politically acceptable to move towards renewables. And just, that's the sort of pressure that Rishi Sunak is responding to when he makes his announcements last week. But you need, and that's the transition cost that needs to be managed in some countries, and it's going to be very significant.
Absolutely. And actually, we do have another question there. And before that, we have seen more than 80% decline in technology costs for renewables over the last decade, and we can continue seeing that. So that's something really to think about. Please.
Good morning. My name is Trevor Hutchings. I'm from a international consultancy called BIP, and we're actually partnering with Imperial on a nature-based solutions project. But my question for the panel is this, that one of the characteristics of the clean energy transition is moving from a fuel-intensive energy system to a very much a material-intensive energy system. I think some of the statistics are around 9 times the amount of material is needed for an offshore wind farm compared to the same capacity gas turbine generation. So as we move along that path, there's clearly supply chain risks, and there's also risks around storing up a tsunami of waste of PV panels and so on. And I guess my question to the panel then is, what's the role of the investor community in demanding more circular economy business models as they're investing in renewable technologies?
Who would like to take this? Keith.
The ESG aspects of our investment are front and centre. We're currently building the largest solar and storage projects in the US and also in the UK. As part of that investment, at the outset, we pay the recycling cost of all of the panels. So we're guaranteeing that those panels will get recycled. As an infrastructure investor, not where we are at the moment, but possibly in our next offering, we're looking at the recycling of the infrastructure which goes into renewable projects. I think the biggest issue we're having at the moment is recycling of turbine blades. I've seen some solutions to that. Children's play parks, and I think of some of them. I don't know how many children's play parks you can build, but there's a lot of blades which are obviously going to be recycled soon. But it is a critical consideration for us, and that is something that we are looking to invest in.
Thank you. I think we will need to actually wrap up. And to your point, like we have all of this. New technology build out, but also do we have enough investment in some recycling capabilities for wind turbines, for batteries in the next 5 to 10 years? Are we going to be seeing another hazard? There are some organizations that are already dealing with that, but unfortunately, again, returns on investment for some recycling capabilities are not exactly the same. So who should it sit with? Probably should sit, with this integrated chain. Tesla can pay even for that, even without them getting this massive return on recycling batteries. So kind of who is responsible? Well, everyone is really responsible, from governments, but also from large players who are actually, having much chunkier margins in other businesses. It just makes sense, like who is, who should and who is able to. So I think that is, we should be asking both questions. And so thank you. We say? Yeah, one more. Perfect. Let's.
Just one comment though, if I may, behind the premise of the question. The premise of the question is you basically asking firms to internalize their externalities, right? But great, go for it. But don't lose sight of the fact that the gas power station you're talking about is going to generate a massive externality, which is all the CO2 that it'll be putting into the atmosphere. So unless you're applying a similar metric to that, you're not having a balanced equation.
Exactly. I think there's a lady up front.
Yeah, so my question kind of follows on the previous one as well, and it's more at the project level. And it's more at the project level, but I'm just kind of curious about whether you could speak to the impact of land use change on, and I guess the conflict between land use change and renewables, especially when you're talking about emerging markets and biodiversity-rich nations. So just curious as to how you as investors are dealing with that, or whether you have any frameworks in place to deal with the environmental impact of renewable energy projects.
Food v energy is probably at the heart of your question. We refuse to invest on any high-grade agricultural land. It has to be 3B or below in terms of the quality of the land that we'll install a project on, especially if it's something which is going to take up a lot of land. Like the solar storage project we're building in Kent is nearly 900 acres. That is on very, very low-grade land. It's land which would otherwise be flooded in a few years' time. But we're maintaining the seawall as part of that consent. So yeah, effectively our approach is we just won't build on land which is highly of high grade for agricultural or food purposes.
It's funny you asked that question because I was sat in the office yesterday and I kid you not, the person next to me was having a conversation and all I could hear was her end of it. And she was saying, so do the shepherds manage to herd the sheep around the solar panels? And do the solar panels create any difficulties in herding the sheep? And what does it do to the quality of the grass? And it was not a conversation, I'm new to Standard Chartered, it was not a conversation I expected to hear upon joining the bank, but it's indicative of the fact that we do take those sorts of considerations very seriously. But again, zoom the camera back. This is oft stated in the UK, there is more land occupied by golf courses in the UK, for example, which have a very detrimental effect on biodiversity than there are, solar panels. So it's important to kind of keep those considerations in mind as well.
No, thank you. I just wanted to add that changing zoning and getting the land permit is difficult. It's not easy in developed market, and it's even more challenging in emerging market if you want to bring the international environment and social safeguard standards. So as a fund investor to infrastructure fund managers, when we commit to the fund, we require them to agree on specific environmental and social safeguard standards, which will stipulate what are the requirements if the project requires relocation or the resettlement, and if they find some endangered species in the region. So a lot of European DFIs follow IFC Performance Standard 1, and they adapt some of the languages based on their internal transactional data.
Absolutely, and you always want to have to balance different things and to the extent possible with as little damage as possible. But it's not like other sources of energy are not harming nature in terms of, if you think comparable, you do still need facilities for different fuel production. So it is really important to do it in a fair and just way, and also think that that comparable plant is not going to potentially could be a lot more harmful as well. Well, thank you all for your questions. Thank you to our panel. We really hope that next time we all meet, when we're looking at some investment gaps, they're no longer 150 billion annually in a single region. It will be hopefully diminished. Keith will potentially invest in a few assets in the ASEAN region and contribute to that investment, shortfall shrinking over time, as will hopefully all of you if you're investors and non-dedicated to this region or just EM broadly. So thank you so much. We learned a lot. And